And one of the things I'm very proud of about our team at Bath University is that very unusually we do major in Indian and Far Eastern philosophies with our students. Not many universities do that on the philosophy side. And on the religion side, we believe very strongly that our students ought to meet people from different religious communities. And one of the places that we send them to spend a week is a sort of Zen monastery. So both religion and philosophy at Bath are interested in Far Eastern traditions. I'll break over. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Brian Schroeder, who is Professor of Philosophy and Director of Religious Studies. So again, we've got both sides, at the Rochester Institute of Technology, New York. He has written numerous books and edited others, mostly in the field either of Japanese philosophy or philosophy and ecology, both of which we're very interested in at Bath. He is also a sort of Zen priest, and so we have the academic side and also the practitioner side. And I'm really looking forward to hearing about Korean Minjung, because that's something I don't know anything about. But it is connected to engaged religion, which I'm very interested in. Religion, that means engaged socially and politically, and trying to make this world here and now a better place, rather than solely thinking of personal spiritual development. So over to you, Professor Schroeder, and we're really looking forward to hearing this.
Well, let me first of all begin. Can you hear me fine? Okay. With thanking Sarah and everyone connected with the philosophy department at Bath Spa and the museum for putting together this colloquium. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. Korean Minjung thinkings had a considerable impact on both engaged Buddhism and Christian liberation theology. A relatively unknown form of Buddhism, Minjung developed largely in the 1970s and 80s before being repressed by both the Korean government and other religious forces in the 1990s and afterward. During that time, Minjung Buddhism also gave rise to Minjung Christian liberation theology. Taking on directly the intersection of the religious, social, and political dimensions of existence, Minjung offers a significant contribution to the question of formulating a global ethics. Today, I want to draw attention especially to the Minjung mask dance, which is an old Buddhist ritual that was revived and given new impetus as a model of an existential embodied approach to helping to overcome or transcend the nihilism of hatred, resentment, and revenge. These expressions of nihilism, the deepest problem of our age and what is most counter to the development of community, are endemic and not confined to any particular society or culture. A global ethics must begin by eradicating what Nietzsche refers to as the spirit of gravity in order to develop a non-egoistic standpoint, or what in Buddhism is referred to as anatman, non-ego or no self. Only from this radical standpoint is the sharing possible that is the basis of ethical community, or pratitya samuppada, dependent origination. Minjung is a rather difficult term to translate. It's a combination of two Chinese words, min, people, jung, masses. The term, though, appropriately applies to any individual or group of individuals that are oppressed either politically, socially, or economically through the prejudices of sex, race, color, nationality, or creed. And yet, while denoting the oppressed in the general sense of its meaning, Minjung, as it is stressed by its theorists, is nevertheless a distinctively Korean way of thinking. That said, Minjung is never. Minjung is nevertheless a way of thinking that extends beyond cultural and ethnic boundaries, insofar as it speaks to a universal or global ethical and political condition. Minjung is a thinking of the people and not merely for the people. It's a cultural anthropology, insofar as it, writes Kim Young-bak, quote, defines its own existence and generates new acts and dramas in history through its own stories. Now, some Minjung theorists, therefore, interpret the people to be the subjects of history and not the mere objects of a higher salvation history. The existence from this standpoint does have a purpose, and the divine purpose for creation is enacted within history through the poor and the oppressed for their sake. It is the Minjung who are the constant reality of history, not the myriad of kingdoms, empires, and nation-states that pass in and out of existence. Minjung thinking aspires to what Hyung Yong Hak calls critical transcendence. This notion refers to the experience of the Minjung as they participate in the mask dance. As I said before, a traditional old village Buddhist festival that was originally performed to pacify the gods and is still practiced today in several Buddhist cultures, of course in various forms. In the 19th century, the Korean version of the mask dance was transformed into a play. And this play was performed for the sake of the Minjung, the ordinary suppressed people. In this dance/play, the villagers are able to vent their frustration and rage toward their oppressors. The mask dance thus takes on the form of a social political satire in which the Minjung are able to poke fun at and ridicule their rulers, both political and religious, as well as poking fun at themselves and their own fate in the world. In doing so, a sense of objectivity is afforded to the Minjung in the dance. This objectivity or critical transcendence, though, is not given to the people from the outside, for instance, from God or some objectively existing reality. Rather, it emerges from the experience of the Minjung themselves. In describing the mask dance, Hyun writes, quote, in and through the dance, the Minjung experience and express this critical transcendence over the world and are able to laugh at its absurdity. The Minjung lament their lot, but they do it with humor. They laugh at and make fun of their own fate in the world and thereby transcend their own conditions. They find themselves standing over and beyond the entire world, which includes not only the rulers and leaders, but also themselves and their own religion. They not only see correctly the reality of the world, which neither leaders nor rulers can see because of their obsession or separation from the world, but also envision another reality over and against and beyond this one, which neither the rulers or leaders can see either. One of the central concerns of Minjung thinking is the utilization of the energy manifest in the critical transcendence of the mask dance for bringing about what we might call the messianic realm. The conscientization of the Minjung about their oppression, which explodes into reality in the mask dance, provides the necessary impetus for the transformation of a potentially self-destructive energy. This self-destructive energy in Korean is known as Han, and it's transforming Han into a viable social political practice and praxis. What's critically transcended in the mask dance is the accumulated, suppressed, and unresolved sense of resentment against the injustices suffered by the Minjung. The force or energy of Han can manifest itself in two ways, either as a destructive negating force or as a positive affirming force. It's the latter that Minjung thinking hopes to channel and utilize for the purpose of social transformation. It's an embodied field, which Spinoza understands as affect, that may express itself artistically as in the mass dance, or as Kuhn would write, as a tendency for social revolution, brought on by a feeling with a tenacity of will for life. Han can manifest itself as fearful Han, as a destructive, violent, revengeful force capable of negating to the point of self-destruction. Thus, writes Sunandong, accumulated Han must be met with continuous Dan. Dan is self-denial, a detachment of oneself from the vicious cycle of Han. But Dan is not a once-and-for-all event. Like Han, Dan is a process, functioning at times as a release valve for the built-up pressure of accumulated resentment, anger, hatred, what Nietzsche refers to as ressentiment, and at other times as a fuel for social transformation. While Han and Dan are dialectically different from one another, there is a fundamental unity between them. It is this unity that allows Han to be sublated by Dan, thus raising Han to a higher, more positive level of force or energy. A movement that's similar to Hegel's notion of Aufhebung. But unlike Hegel's understanding, this positivity is not necessarily determined or even logical. The Buddha nature, realized in this movement, is enacted only when the will to rationally achieve this positivity is abandoned. This abandoning or relinquishing of the egoistic will or desire to ultimately control one's own fate and that of the world in which one lives is a fundamental aspect of the mass dance. As the Japanese Kyoto school philosopher Tanabe Hajime realizes in his later work, while reassessing both his personal and societal life in the aftermath of World War II and Japanese imperialism, Tanabe writes, what's needed is to critically transcend the egoism of the Hegelian dialectic and the hegemony of the rational standpoint. This is the moment that he designates, borrowing an old Greek term, as metanoia, a conversion or a change of heart-mind, or shin. And this is precisely what occurs when the Minjung mass dance is truly actualized. Now, to speak of potentially explosive forces such as Han necessarily brings one to the question of the status of power, and particularly of political power. How is it possible to harness the revolutionary potential of Han, this accumulated resentment and frustration, into a force capable of fostering genuine social and political change? What does it mean to liberate the Minjung from the yoke of oppression and exploitation, if not in an actual sense? Some Minjung theorists refer to a tamed political realism. But what is that, if not simply an only partially committed realpolitik? In order to transform Han into an affirmative social political force, the critical transcendence afforded to the Minjung must be concretely, humanly actualized. And this is accomplished through the mechanism of Dan, which literally means to cut, to sever. In its existential signification, though, Dan is self-denial. But what is denied here? It is not the yearning for individual rights and freedoms or the place of the individual in society. The self-denial of Dan is the willful commitment to place the needs of society, of the Minjung as a whole, before the needs of the individual. As such, it is a willing of non-willing. In terms of social political praxis, in order to reverse the oppressive structure of top-to-down politics. There must be a denial of the individual will in order to realize the greater subjecthood of the community. Top-to-down politics negates the subjecthood of Minjung as community and instead inserts a notion of the individual. And this is misleading because the individual is divested then of any real political power. All policy decision-making decisions are enacted and dictated by a relatively small number of individuals who then enjoy alone freedom and prosperity in any totalitarian political structure. So the hope of the Minjung is through this common conscientization, as some of their theorists refer to it, through this common realization of their plight and the assertion of themselves as a body of political force, which can mean, ironically, an actual involvement in real politics. But can this eschatological hope, as Minjung liberation theologians want to frame it, can this hope of the Minjung be spiritualized to the point of non-involvement in this world, as perhaps some 19th century German philosophers, and thinking primarily here of Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, interpreted Buddhism? Hunger and oppression are, as we know, concrete problems arising from concrete social political realities. Should real politics, though, be assumed to always imply the use of violent force as a means for revolutionary transformation? This is one of the reasons why the Korean government, the South Korean government in the 1980s and 90s really went all out to repress the Minjung movement because it was wrongly construed, misidentified as a political revolutionary movement. Now, there is that revolutionary dimension to it, but it's not revolutionary in the sense of advocating violent overthrow. If what Kim Yong-bak means by real politics is only brute pragmatic force, then he is correct in asserting that it should never be used as a vehicle for praxis. However, a more refined sense of real politics is possible, and this is what Minjung thinking wants to tap into. And not only is it possible, but it is necessary if the messianic is to become a reality in the world. But this does not mean that necessarily that Minjung involvement in the spectrum of real politics will result in a form of what Marx refers to as the dictatorship of the proletariat on the part of the Minjung. In fact, Kim sees this as an impossibility. He writes, historically, the Minjung is always in the condition of being ruled, a situation which they seek to overcome. Therefore, Minjung history will never permit the glorification of the Minjung so that its name may be used to justify any form of political dictatorship, especially the totalitarian kind. In many ways, the Minjung view of history has an affinity with the cultural values of Western democracy. But the constituency of the Minjung is the poor and the suppressed who are alienated in their social and political and economic conditions. Now, this last statement of Kim's perhaps explains his reticence about engaging in real politics. So I find Kim to be a particularly important Minjung theorist because he's, on the one hand, one of those that really is addressing the concrete political aspect of it, and yet at the same time is, of the Minjung theorists, one of the most internally critical. So Kim is not following others by saying, well, what we really need is more active engagement in real politics. The current technocratic political state in South Korea is clearly aligned with the ideals of the capitalist Western world, and in particular with those, arguably, of the United States. Western democracy, which for many has, in this day of globalization, become virtually synonymous with capitalism, is the logical position for the Minjung consciousness to gravitate toward given this current alliance with the West. Kim also notes, however, that the Minjung are those who are alienated in their political and economic condition. So whatever the reason for their past alienation or alienations, the present alienation of the Minjung is now due, at least in part, to the totalitarianism of present-day technocratic capitalism. Therefore, Minjung thinking must address, says Kim, the political alienation in terms of socio-economic alienation. And of course, it's this obvious connection with dominant themes of Marxism that has drawn Minjung thinking under fire by its critics, much in the same way that Latin American liberation theologians were criticized not only by the Roman Church, but also by Western governments as being covers for Marxism under the guise of theology. Now, on the whole, Minjung theorists seem to be unclear and separated regarding the interface of political and socioeconomic determinism. Let me just pause here for a moment, too, and point out that I'm referring to Minjung thinking rather than simply Minjung Buddhist thinking or Minjung liberation thinking, because what is a unique aspect of Minjung is that through this common realization of the plight of Minjung, two very different religious traditions have been able to come together. And yet the actual social and political reality is that mainline Christianity and mainline Korean Buddhism are oftentimes butting heads. And so both the established Christianity and the established Buddhism in Korea, which is primarily Song, version of Zen, Chan, really found themselves on common ground in being equally marginalized. And so their theorists tend to be pretty much in sync. And so I want to refer to them in that more unified way. On the whole, Minjung theorists seem to be unclear and separating, as I said, regarding the interface of social, economic, and political determinism. And this is due in part to the ideological confrontation with communist North Korea. Minjung theologians do not want their discourse to be subverted or co-opted by the communists, and therefore they've been hesitant to adopt the language of the Latin American or even North American liberation theologians, which have often relied heavily at times on Marxist-based class analysis. When you read the Buddhist Minjung theorists, that's not a problem, obviously, that they've had to take up because of the historical and cultural conditions of their religious tradition. It's doubtful, however, whether the separation between political and socio-economic determinism can be maintained by some Minjung theorists solely on the basis of past confrontations with communist North Korea. It is certainly problematic, though, to assume that all socialist ideologies will result in some form of totalitarian politics, as the critics of Minjung claim, and it's questionable whether one can seriously make a distinction, therefore, between the political and the social economic. The collapse of these two realities seems, to me at least, to be one of the earmarks of postmodern industrialized capitalism. Now, I want to turn to a comparative approach here, and the thinker that I want to engage is one that I've already mentioned a couple times, and that is Nietzsche, because I think Nietzsche really helps give us a bit of insight, particularly into the interplay of Han and Da. A growing ressentiment, to borrow Nietzsche's term, is infecting Western culture to the point of nihilism. But not just Western culture. Nietzsche, of course, was primarily concerned with European nihilism, but nihilism is not endemic just to the West. With regard to this, What can be learned, therefore, from Minjung thinking? Well, perhaps this dialectical interplay between Han and Dan offers a key toward tackling the problem of nihilism. Han, I think, bears a very close resemblance to the notion of raison d'être. And Nietzsche embodies a very important aspect of the spirit that must be embraced by Western thinking if it's to avoid the path of self-destructive nihilism. The raison d'être that Nietzsche speaks of is both similar to, as I said, but also different from the notion of Han. It is different in the sense that Han is a phenomenon both recognized and understood by the Minjung, hence giving rise to the correlative mechanism or movement of Dan. Western raison d'être, one could say, is a type of cancer that eats away at the social fabric of society because it develops, for the most part, without being detected until it is too late. Remember, Nietzsche claims that the history of Western metaphysics is the history of the unfolding of nihilism, which begins back in the very beginning of what we consider to be Western culture and thought. The separation of the true world from an apparent world. This is due, this resulting moment is due largely to its individualistic nature, which follows suit with the unfolding of the Western history of ideas, reinforced in the ideals of the Enlightenment, which to this day still govern much of our social, political, and ethical discourse. Raison is a somewhat difficult term to translate. Yes, it has the meaning of its cognate resentment, and thus is similar to Han, but it also signifies something more aggressive, hatred, revenge. And the most extreme form or manifestation of raison d'être, Nietzsche writes, occurs as a hatred of time itself. This hatred of time and its it was, he locates in the Christian doctrines of the Last Judgment and of the kingdom of God beyond this world. These two doctrines, he maintains, turn the European consciousness away from affirming life in this world, life in the world of time, or becoming. The inevitable breakdown of the traditional theological notion of a providential deity has left Western culture confronted with the crisis of the death of God, and thus the advent of so-called European nihilism. Traditional Western forms of theology and philosophy, that includes classical metaphysics, what Heidegger refers to as ontotheology, can be characterized as the ill-fated attempt to absolve any permanent relationship with the world, with temporality. The spirit of revenge, my friends, writes Nietzsche, has so far been the subject of our best reflection. And wherever there was suffering, there punishment was also wanted. In Nietzsche's account, raison finds its strongest expression, as I said, beginning with the Platonic positing of the good beyond being, the notion of the last judgment, the idea that there are those who are predestined to either salvation or damnation. In the notion of the Christian last judgment, Nietzsche makes it quite clear who was responsible, and it was not Jesus. Jesus, rather, as he writes in the Antichrist, was the exemplar of the superiority over any form of raison d'être. Not quote from Nietzsche. After all, Jesus could not intend anything with his death except to give publicly the strongest exhibition, the proof of his doctrine. But his disciples were far from forgiving this death. That would have been evangelical in the highest sense. Precisely the most unevangelical feeling, revenge, came to the fore again. The matter could not possibly be finished with this death. Retribution was needed. Judgment. And yet what could be more unevangelical than retribution? Punishment. Sitting in judgment. It's not the hatred of the world, or the senses even, that characterize the feeling or spirit of revenge, so much then as it is the positing of truth, or the true life beyond the confines of the spatio-temporal horizon. The feeling of resentment is destroyed by the affirmation of what is commonly considered as negative, that is, time and the distance it signifies in its dialectical relationship to eternity. And ironically for Nietzsche, it's Jesus who comes to realize this, only to be reversed by the subsequent Christian tradition. He writes, in the whole psychology of the evangel, the concept of guilt and punishment is also lacking. But so too is also the concept of reward. Sin, that is, any distance separating God and humanity, is abolished. This is precisely the glad tidings. Blessedness, therefore, is not promised, it's not tied to conditions, it's the only reality, the sign, the rest is a sign with which to speak of it. Similarly, one can find a similar teaching in Shakyamuni Buddha, who also, in his day, took on the cultural context and was a radical critic of the Atman Brahman thinking that was beginning to emerge as dominant and higher expressions of Hinduism, which were then used to help solidify and maintain, reinforce the caste system. Separation of God and humanity, of Buddha nature and the individual or the existing being. That's the problem. The Minjung recognized this, and in the math dance, there is an attempt to move beyond simply the theoretical grasping of this understanding and indicate a movement toward an embodied actualization or realization of it. And it's only possible, though, if it's radicalized to the point where what is being cut off, what is being denied, what is being rejected and criticized is not only the oppressive external outside, but also the internal self that sees itself as victim. This is what is, of course, so difficult in Buddhist practice. The realization of Atman cannot occur at the intellectual level. This is why practice ultimately is paramount. The mass dance is a form of practice. Zazen is another form, or in its more contemporary expressions, engaged action, engaged Buddhism is seen as the liberating practice. So Minjung thinking is an attempt to realize this state of blessedness, of Buddha nature, and thereby realize, from the Christian standpoint, the messianic promise of the gospel of Jesus as immanent. But to recognize from the Buddhist standpoint that Buddha nature is not something out there, it is not something that we possess, it is simply that name of what refers to the actual existing condition as it is here and now. Like the Minjung, who are able to sublate the potentially destructive force of Han through the mechanism of Dan in the mass dance, Western culture, I would submit, also needs similar structures for overcoming ressentiment. On Nietzsche's analysis, what's needed for this overcoming is a strong affirmative will. All existence, for him, is will to power, the genetic and differential interplay of active and reactive forces. What characterizes this strong overcoming will is the ability to will backwards, which on one hand is an impossibility, and yet on the other hand is precisely what is needed in order to move beyond the egoistic standpoint. So this willing backwards, how should we understand this? Well, I think that Nietzsche is referring to the ability to affirm time and all that has happened within time, and this coupled with what he terms active forgetting, over and beyond simply mere forgiveness, this is what constitutes, manifests the ability not to carry the injustices of the past over into the present and future as a feeling of ressentiment. Nietzsche's analysis is obviously not the only approach to the problem, of course, but it certainly represents one of the most provocative and penetrating critiques of the issue. So specifically, what is needed, therefore, I submit, is a mechanism similar to Dan in order to reconstruct, or redirect, rather, the dangerous energies of ressentiment from a self-destructive nihilism to a vehicle for positive social, political, and economic transformation. Now, what's the connection between this sublation, this dialectical sublation, and the critical transcendence of Han and the overcoming of ressentiment? What's common to both of these strategies is the aspect of self-denial, a certain renunciation. I'm not talking, you certainly know that Nietzsche is very critical of the ascetic ideal. And this is not what is being advocated here. This is obviously not a new theme. It has its notions as far back as the Buddhist concept of anatma. Paralleling the teaching of Shakyamuni Buddha, Jesus employs this concept in his admonition that one must lose oneself in order to find oneself. Thus, the mechanism of Dan is clearly compatible with a hermeneutic of self-denial. Hegel and Nietzsche's pronouncement of the death of God, which is also a death of a certain conception of the self, marked the inauguration of the theme of self-denial into contemporary mainstream Western philosophical and theological discourse. Although, of course, this notion is also present within certain isolated, later, marginalized contexts, even suppressed contexts, such as medieval Christian mysticism. This death or overcoming of the self, construed here in terms of self-denial, is not, as mentioned before, only a transferal of the importance of one's individual subjectivity for the greater intersubjectivity or collective subjecthood of the community. It is that, certainly, and this is necessary for any liberating praxis to occur. What must be avoided, though, is losing an authentic sense of community under any rubric of the state or the society that tends toward a totalitarian or totalizing structure. This fear of authoritarianism, which has afflicted the Korean Minjung throughout history, partially explains the reason why Minjung theorists are so reticent to employ the language of liberation that often utilizes a Marxian analysis of class oppression. The employment of such conceptual tools, however, will not necessarily result in a reduction of the Minjung community to a dictatorship of the proletariat, although such a reductionism must surely be guarded against. So, let me conclude. The death of the self, or rather of a certain sovereign conception of the self, which is fundamental for the promotion of community, is contingent on the recognition of the ethical interrelation that exists with every other being. This is expressed in Buddhism as anatma. And this cannot be fully understood or even realized apart from its connection with dependent origination, the fundamental metaphysical concept of Buddhism. In both Minjung Buddhism and Minjung theology, community is not a totality of believers unified under the ideology of the universal cradle faith. Community is based on the just reciprocity of every being. Respect for difference, an acknowledgement of ethical transcendence based on overcoming the exaltation of the self over the other, is the first step toward undermining the roots of oppression and moving toward the formation of a global ethical sensibility and genuine community built on liberating praxis. Taking a look at the Korean Minjung mask dance serves as an inspiration, I believe, for us to continually think about what types of embodied contexts we can develop and practice in order to help us overcome our very individualistic orientation in the West. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Professor Schroeder. That was fascinating. And we've got lots of, because we started a bit early, we've got lots of time for questions. So we're open to the floor. Yes? Yes?
Yeah. You just mentioned about this Minjung dance, this mass dance is from 19th century.
Well, in the 19th century, I said it was transformed in Korea into a play.
Oh, into a play.
Into a satire.
Yeah.
Actually. The dance is historically much older.
Yeah, because I'm wondering, because maybe we can draw a parallel between the shamanism in Korea, also in the northern region of China. They practice a lot. Shamanism involves mass dance.
That's right.
And so I think maybe because they have this cultural heritage, and later this Buddhist thing come back. But this idea, if we use the primitive shamanism to interpret, we can also find somehow during this mass dance they have this self-negation, they somehow reach a collective unconsciousness because of this shaman dance. So, but I'm not I don't even know Minjung before, so I expect I would like to hear your opinion. If we could draw this kind of parallel, maybe we can continue to do some research between the Minjung kind of practice and